Leviticus chapter 1. And maybe before we even get to Leviticus chapter 1, it'd be good to flip over to Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Romans chapter 12 says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. I remember perhaps the first time I heard it put so powerfully was at a men's conference, or men's retreat actually. And Ken Graves was there. And he was just saying, it's reasonable, and you think about it where if someone, had paid off your mortgage, paid off your car payment, filled your house with furniture and done all these things, and then asked you if you could, carry something for him, you would think, well, it's beyond reasonable. And that's, of course, what God has done for us as he's paid the price, paid in full. And the mindset that every born-again believer should have. And I would fear for a Christian who doesn't have this sense within them that it is your reasonable service to give God everything. We might struggle in practicality to do it, but that it's reasonable for us to give God everything. It's reasonable for us to forsake entertainment and amusement and fun in order to seek the Lord, to go to bed early so that we can rise early, to say no to other things that would distract us from gathering together with the saints and getting together and fellowshipping, showing up to pray, showing up to study, showing up to gather with one another. And so the first offering in the book of Leviticus is the burnt offering. It's an offering of dedication or consecration. It represents devotion and total surrender. And again, as you go through here, all the little things, they add up to something bigger and more significant. And so it says, now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle meeting, saying, and I'll throw out here a little nugget, is the book begins with and. Exodus begins with the word and. Leviticus begins with and. Numbers begins with and. Deuteronomy begins with and. Joshua begins with and. Judges begins with and. Every book begins with and, all the way up until you get to the end of 2 Kings, because from Genesis to 2 Kings, the Bible is totally chronological. And it's not until you move to Chronicles where things flip back and start over again, and they go back and repeat stuff. But anyway, fun fact. Verse 2, speak to the children of Israel, saying to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd, and of the flock. Our word in the Hebrew there for offering is korban. That might sound familiar, right? Mark 7:11. It's also in the Gospels where, Jesus talks about how the Pharisees were calling stuff korban. Well, they really just wanted to keep it for themselves, but they were saying, well, I can't give this away because I'm keeping it so that it can one day be an offering to the Lord, an offering, something dedicated to the Lord. Of his offering is a burnt sacrifice, or if his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. It's a free will offering. God isn't forcing total surrender. God isn't forcing total consecration. God isn't forcing people to be filled with the Holy Spirit and living their lives for him. It's something that he hopes and woos us toward, is that we offer ourselves up freely. And so it shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. Atonement, the payment that sets us right with God. Jesus Christ was our atonement. Or I like how Pastor Chuck once put it, you can break that word up to mean at one meant. at one with God. And so it pays the price. He kills the bull before the Lord, the priest, Aaron. They shall sprinkle the blood around the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle meeting. He shall skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. And again, as you go through all the offerings, there's these little nuggets like how Jesus Christ was stripped before he was offered. Verse 7, the sons of Aaron the priest shall put the fire on the altar and lay the wood in order, and the priest and Aaron's son shall lay the parts, the head, the fat on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But they shall wash the entrails and the legs with water. Now, for what it's worth, those are the outward parts that would be defiled, covered in poo-poo. So they wash all that stuff before it gets offered up. And you'll note, because they're offering all of it, because it says the priest shall burn all on the altar. Normally they don't burn all the parts. Quite often the priests eat some of it. But with the total consecration offering, everything gets burned. It's a total surrender. It's a full living sacrifice, we're called. That's the idea. We are the contrast in Romans 12. We're a living sacrifice. We don't have to die to be a sacrifice. But here, it was all symbolic. And so they burn all of it. An offering made by fire, sweet aroma to the Lord. Verse 10, and his offering is of the flocks. If it's of the flock, of the sheep, of the goats, as a burnt offering, he shall bring the male without blemish. He shall kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord and the priests. Aaron's sons shall sprinkle its blood all around the altar. One reason, I'll throw it out here. I see Steve is watching. Any of you who've been to Israel, Steve was just there with me. There are two locations that have been proposed for where the crucifixion of Jesus took place. And I'm a very large advocate that Calvary is Gordon's Calvary by the Garden Tomb, and it's on the north side of the temple. And there's something there to that, I think. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is on the west side. But here on the north side of the altar is where this offering would be slain. It's where all the offerings were slain. It's on the north side of the altar. And Jesus Christ was crucified on the north side of the temple, right outside that Damascus gate. Verse 12, he shall cut it into pieces with its head, its fat, and the priest shall lay them in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But he shall wash the entrails and legs with water. Then the priest shall bring it all and burn it on the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. A fascinating fact. As we kind of wrap up, it's going to repeat stuff again, talking about if they bring pigeons or turtle doves. Again, it's the same ceremony, but for people who couldn't afford a lamb. But this word here in verse 13, katir, it's typically the word used for burning incense, not the word used in the sin offerings coming up in the later chapters here. There's a different word used for burning there. And so it's just fascinating that this total surrender, whole burnt offering, they use the word for incense burning. Because as it says there in verse 13, it is a sweet aroma to the Lord. And that's what it's supposed to be. Our total surrender is a sweet aroma to the Lord. And we live in a modern day with a cupboard full of spices that these Israelites would have killed for, being stuck in the wilderness like they were. And we take for granted how many things we've smelled, how many things we've tasted. When the Bible speaks of honey, there just really was nothing as sweet as honey. There's nothing else to compare really to the sweetness of honey. And when you think about smells, we have all these smells, and they smell so good. But back then, to be honest, there's incense, which had a very pleasant smell of its own, kind of an artificial smell, right? You're mixing stuff and burning it, but then also the smell of cooking meat, of fat, cooking on the grill. That smell that fills a house and that smell going up from that altar, there really wasn't much a better smell you could have experienced back then than the smell of fatty meat cooking over the fire. And we are to live our lives in such a way. It's a picture of this. that from us and our living sacrifice, the way we live, it just puts off this smell. It fills a room. It's something that draws people in. It's something that brings a pleasantness to the world around us. And it's absolutely something that brings a pleasantness to God. And so we are to be living sacrifices. And so this whole burnt offering, that's what it is. This is the life fully surrendered to God. The priests don't eat of it like some of the other ones. The people don't eat of it like some of the other sacrifices. This one is just all in. Throw the whole animal on there once you clean off these parts and separate, but the whole animal's going, and it's all going to be burned. 14 to 17 is just a repeat, but it talks about turtle doves or young pigeons. And if you're a note taker, Leviticus 12, 6 to 8 is just a little fun note. As we first see this, it talks about that if someone can't afford an offering of the herd or the flock, that the turtle doves and the pigeons were an acceptable alternative. God didn't think less of them. If that's all the people could afford, that's all the people could afford. And in Luke chapter 2, verses 22 to 24, we can recall that when Joseph and Mary go to the temple to offer up an offering because of the child that was born to them, they offered up turtle doves because they couldn't afford something from the flock or from the herd. So it's just another fun reminder, too, that Jesus grew up in a poor family that didn't have very much money. And so in one more way, Jesus can relate to many of us in our experiences growing up in a poor family. So, boom, there we go. Chapter 1 is done. Tomorrow, chapter 2, the grain offering, which is another free will offering, symbolic of yet another thing that's very important to God. And we'll take a look at that tomorrow. So, God bless you guys. Have a great day, and I will see you then.